So good afternoon, everyone who might be in US Eastern Time, and good evening to those of you who might be over in Europe. And I guess good morning to some of you who might be on the West Coast, but we are very happy that you are with us for this take two of this conversation with this group of folks from the Southern Poverty Law Center, from Teaching Tolerance. Homa will introduce them quickly here in a second. But we are just thrilled to be able to have this conversation again. We had our first take at this at 7 a.m. this morning, and it was just a brilliant conversation. And I know that this one is going to be just as informative and inspiring and thoughtful as well. Just want you to know that we hope that you participate in the chat, and that I will be relaying any questions that you might have from the chat on YouTube into the Zoom room that we're streaming from. So we hope that you will be a part of this conversation as it takes place. We'll also be sharing some links to the podcast that we're going to be discussing today on this session, and definitely hope that you take a listen to that. It's an inspiring story. It's a challenging story, but it's one that we think is very important to get out into the world. And that's one of the reasons why, again, we're really happy to be able to do this and to support this work today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Homa, and she will welcome our guests, and we'll get started with the conversation.
Thank you, Will. Welcome everyone tuning in. I see we already have people from all over the world joining us. It's very exciting, from Lebanon to La Paz. And I am going to share a short video to give us a preview of the discussion around this incredible podcast that frames what we're about to talk about. So we'll take 1 minute and watch this.
Series Sounds Like Hate.
I've been physically assaulted and was repeatedly called the N-word, and that I was going to get shot.
I see my students with Nazi symbols on their hands. I'm hearing an uptick in the N-word. I just was like, what is happening?
We take you inside a high school caught in the crosshairs of racism and a battle ripping their community apart.
I potentially have a fire here that can devolve into violence.
Will students at Randolph Union High School in Vermont raise a Black Lives Matter flag?
When I see that flag and I read it, it tells me my life don't matter because I'm not black.
I see all of your black power, but where's white power?
And will the school change their beloved mascot, a galloping ghost resembling a KKK knight? What was one of the first racist symbols that you saw in this school?
The mascot was probably the first. It just shows that people kind of turn a blind eye to racism.
Independent journalism. Subscribe and listen to Sounds Like Hate, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere you get your favorite podcasts.
So this frames a serious conversation that we are having today, and we're so glad to have so many friends from near and far joining us. As Will said, we had this conversation earlier today as well, and this is sort of our encore webinar. So I want to just give a quick rundown of who is with us today. If you signed up for the webinar, you would have already received more in-depth bios because we have a truly distinguished panel. But I just quickly want to introduce Jamila Paksima. Jamila is the executive producer, director, host, storyteller for this powerful podcast series. Elijah Hawks is the principal at Randolph Union High School, and he's also an author. Corey Collins is the senior writer at Teaching Tolerance. Curtis Reed is the president of the CRJ Consulting Group, and he is the executive director of the Vermont Partnership for Fairness and Diversity. And we have Brittany Malik. Brittany is a graduate of Randolph Union High School and has since been dedicating, dedicating a lot of time to activism, and she is also a performer, and we are delighted to have all of your voices join us. So I want to begin, I want to jump right in and ask Jamila, who has been the framer and the storyteller here, if you could share a little bit out of all, and I want to also back up and say Jamila is also a very distinguished documentary filmmaker. And so podcast is a pretty new platform. But how did you choose this story? Why Randolph Union? Why this? Why now? Tell us, and even just like, how do you even begin to tell such a complicated story? So we'll kick off with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Homa, and thank you, Will. I also just have to thank everybody who's joined and put so much time into sharing the message of what the work that's being done in this space at schools that care about these issues. So me and my colleague Geraldine Mariba have been producing documentaries for most of our career. And we had this opportunity to work with the Southern Poverty Law Center in what we thought would be a powerful opportunity to tell documentary storytelling around very, very difficult issues. And in our research, we decided that our first season for our podcast, which is called Sounds Like Hate, is that we wanted to look at what is causing people to be extremists in their views. What causes that, and how can people disengage from a life of having those extremist views? What brings them across the bridges and so forth? And with it being our first season, we knew we had to pick very extraordinary stories. We wanted definitely to look at the issue of how young people are being called in to extremist views. And it was through that research that we were introduced to Elijah Hawks at Randolph Union High School. He had reached out to Cynthia Idris Miller at American University, and she runs a project there on extremism. And my understanding is that Elijah Hawks had reached out because he has some students that he believed could potentially be on the path of radicalization. And that was sort of the opening door. We got an introduction, and we started to learn a lot more about what was happening at the school. In the year prior, a number of students had tried to raise a Black Lives Matter flag. That became quite divisive in this community. Randolph Union is in the town of Randolph. There's a couple of other cities around. I'll let Elijah tell you, what they are. Braintree, I'm forgetting what the other city is. And several of those families and students, they all come to Randolph. The school is small, about 400 in high school, and it's 95% white. And so for the students of color, for the students brown and Black and other ethnicities, racism is really very real. Students who may not appear Black are called Black and called the N-word on a regular basis. There have been a lot of expressions of hate. There's been physical threats. And some of those students wanted to raise the Black Lives Matter flag to sort of say, this school is not going to stand for this. And so we learned a lot about the process the school went through in trying to get to that place. There's also the issue of the school mascot, which sort of became a revelation for many people. And so on the first day that we arrived, that was a big story in town. This mascot has been around for decades, and it looks like a KKK knight on a horse to many people. And to others, it looks like the mascot, a galloping ghost. And so we follow sort of that story. But the real reason we wanted to be there initially was we learned about this advisory that Elijah was putting together for every single student in the school, and it was around hate symbols. And there were all these hate symbols also showing up in the school. Is the mascot a hate symbol? Students bringing in Confederate flags, are those hate symbols? And all of this confluence was happening. And so it just seemed like the right place to be. And there was a lot of good work actually happening as well. And I'll let Elijah tell you about the initiatives he has with his students.
Thank you so much. You know, before we turn to Elijah, we really want to center Brittany's voice. Brittany, we really have been so appreciative of the courage that you have shown to speak to this difficult topic. And you've been so forthcoming in sharing some really difficult, some really painful experiences. And you've offered to share what it was like to be one of very few students of color at your school. And also, there's a specific story that you talk about in that in the pep rally. So I wonder if you could share a little bit with us. And thank you. And thank you, Jamila.
Yeah, so I am a graduate and alum of Randolph Union High School. I graduated in 2015. And at the time, when I reached my junior year in that regard, I was one of maybe 5, 6 people of color, students of color in the school. You know, I grew up in the environment of an all-white school. Well, not all white, there were still people like me there, but mostly white school, you know, surrounded by just little microaggressions and things like that. Nobody really notices or calls out. You know, there's people wearing belt buckles with the Confederate flag on them and stuff like that. And so I'm not oblivious to microaggressions, racism, stuff like that. And throughout my high school experience, for me personally, high school and school, going to school was kind of that safe place for me to go. That is the place that I looked to for safety, to learn, to grow, to feel comfortable in discovering myself. And, you know, ultimately I put a lot of trust into my school, into my teachers and all of the people around that. And there are like instances outside of that I can still remember being marginalized or being discriminated against, or just feeling confused about who I was in this school. One big story that I remember is a pep rally that we had. No stranger than any other school's pep rally. Like, you have school spirit, like we show that. And so you gather all the students together in a giant gym, giant assembly to just say we have spirit and like we believe in our school and we love our school. So that was the going into this, it was like situation, like we're having a good time, we're all here together. To lead this, all of the athletic sports captains, like every captain for every sports team is a part of the Athletic Leadership Council. And they are the ones who kind of lead the, hey, school pride, we're the Galloping Ghosts, let's go kind of initiative and movement, not movement, but like, you know, that school spirit aspect. At this particular pep rally, it was very different than other ones I've experienced. This group of about 24 students kind of come charging in. There's big double doors. They come charging in on broomsticks, and every single one of them has just a white cloaks, white hoods. They were sheets, but they, to me, obviously, to me, represented someone in a cloaked white outfit that represented the KKK to me. And in that moment, it's like you see a stampede of people running in a room cloaked in white. For me, as a person of color, I immediately am shocked, struck, and immediately like terrified. I'm like, everyone around me, do you see? I'm seeing this. I'm terrified. There's a room of people. There's a group of people running in this room, and they look like KKK members. And then I look around the room, and you know, it's a pep rally. So everyone else is like, yeah, Galloping Ghosts, school spirit, Randolph Union High School, we're great. And I am just confused. I'm hurt. I'm terrified. I honestly I can't even justify. I can't even think about what's happening. I'm just in shock. And I kind of look to the room and I'm like, where are the people who like me? Like, where are the faces that are just as terrified as I am? And one, they're hard to spot because there's only 4 other of them somewhere in the crowd and I can't see them. But around that, it's just so much pride for what's happening. And then in that moment, it's after that initial shock, fear, there's a moment of, for me, I'm like, okay, I trust the school. This is where I feel safe. This is where I connect with most. So if everyone else around me is not upset by this, then obviously, irrationally, I am just making something out of this that's not there. And so it kind of just, it's one of the many things that I kind of just dismissed as, this is what happens. I feel like it's that kind of thing that a lot of people of color go through. It's like, this is the world that my skin color has let me live in, is a world that this kind of stuff happens, and you just have to deal with that kind of stuff. And I am excited that all of this happened, because there are students of color that I think were maybe a little stronger than me to say, no, this cannot happen. This is not okay. And other people have experienced this as well. And we kind of all collectively have that voice of, oh, something is not right here. And it's hard to gauge as a student what that can be. But ultimately, it's just like underlying themes and ideas that are oppressive and terrible and scary.
Yeah. And thanks, Brittany. I mean, if you don't speak up as you have, you know, and I know I've experienced this and many others, you know, we feel like something's wrong with us. And it is so valuable to have an adult who hears you. And so you feel less like it's something wrong with you. And Elijah Hawks has been the principal at the high school. And Elijah is doing a lot now to address this. But the reality has been that, you know, students like Brittany, you said like there were maybe 5 of you in the school that may have been seeing that mascot coming in differently from the rest of the school. So I'm wondering, Elijah, as the principal, how have you worked with your community to address these experiences? And how do you, you know, sort of build dialogue and understanding, given that not everybody feels that way? And some people really want to hold on tight to the mascot, or, you know, talking about Black Lives Matter. So maybe you could share a little bit from your experience.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Glad to be here in dialogue with you, Homa, and Will, and Brittany, Corey, Curtis Reed, and Jamila. Well, Brittany's story about that assembly calls to mind another assembly. And I think, Brittany, it would have been after you graduated. There was a senior young woman who also identifies as a person of color. She brought a letter to me and the other principal at the time. I was working mostly with the lower grades and he with the upper grades, but we were co-principals of the school, and she gave us a letter. And in that letter, she effectively said, you know, here I am, I've finished my senior project, I'm ready to move on in the world, and I'm glad I'm leaving. And she said, I'm worried for my younger sibling. And in that letter, she detailed incidents that had happened in between her and peers, opportunities missed in the curriculum, responses that she thought that she deserved from administration when things were brought to our attention, a long, thoughtful reflection on what wasn't right in her experience and in the school when it came to honoring her identity and the diverse identities that make up the school and the diverse identities that make up our country and our world. That for me was a kind of a turning point. I asked this young woman if I could share her letter with the faculty, and she said yes. And I did that over the summer because we were just days before the final whole school assembly and the last day of school. And I asked her also if I could reference it in the whole school assembly that was going to happen the following day, where there's a couple opportunities every year where I stand in front of the whole school and have an opportunity to speak to them. And I referenced that letter and made a commitment that the following year we would be doing things better and differently when it came to honoring the diverse identities that walk in the door every day. And at the start of the school year, actually, we had 5 or 6 different faculty and staff members who themselves claim an identity that is often derided in the mainstream culture. And this would have been, I think, 2017. And they claimed that identity as a strength, and they talked about what it felt like to hear that identity put down in the school community or in the society more broadly. So a teacher claimed Jewish family heritage and talked about what that meant to him. A teacher claimed her identity as an immigrant to this country. Another teacher claimed Middle Eastern descent. Another teacher talked about a disability, a physical disability that he had. And so we were starting in very public ways to talk about the varying identities that make up our school, and how it's important that we honor those identities and treat everyone with respect. And that kind of dialogue about who we are as people and as a nation and as a school is the kind of dialogue we've been trying to foster throughout the school over the past couple of years at every level, in our faculty meetings, in small group work among colleagues, in our advisory groups with students, in our classes, and indeed in our whole school assemblies, where some of this conversation about the mascot and the Black Lives Matter flag has played out over the last couple of years.
Thank you for that, Elijah. And I know we're going to want to come back and hear more about some of the more tangible steps, because you really have been doing a lot of deep work at the school, reckoning with this legacy. So we want to turn to Curtis Reed, who has been working for a long time in Vermont, particularly around issues of building justice in communities and really educating people also at a profound level. Curtis, could you tell us a little bit about why and how you approached Elijah Hawks about the mascot, and why a little bit in the context of some of the work that you've been doing, and maybe if you feel like we're turning a bit of a corner at all at this moment.
Okay. Well, this isn't our first rodeo working with schools with objectionable mascots. Back in the early 2000s, the Brattleboro Union High School had Colonel Red, which was the poster child of segregationists and the mascot of the University of Mississippi of Ole Miss. Another objectionable mascot was in South Burlington, the Rebels. But what sort of caught my attention, and I'm juxtaposition Brattleboro and Randolph, is sort of the benign neglect on the part of the adults to do their due diligence around imagery and what that imagery represents. And so my approach with Elijah was, I just sent him an email and I said, would you explain the origin story of your mascot, the Galloping Ghost? And he sent me a really polite email back with the photograph of the plaque that explains it. And then I sent him in return the cover of the Birth of a Nation and several still shots from that movie of Klansmen on horses in their white robes, and said that, when I saw your mascot, this is what came to mind for me. And I, took the liberty of visiting the school and saw the 18-foot by 12-foot mural and the clocks, and I was totally aghast and said, now that you know this history, what do you plan to do with it? It wasn't about shaming or blaming him or the school, but it was about now that you know the historical context, what will you do with that information? In Brattleboro, they ultimately decided that they would retire the mascot. They retired the tradition of, flying the Confederate flag. They retired the tradition of burning black dolls, lynching black dolls over bonfires, homecoming bonfires. But the mere presence of historical information for some was enough to say, we need to change this. That's not always the case. There are those adults who choose to be willfully ignorant, even in the face of historical information and context. There are, and some of those adults are educators that choose to respond to these mascots, these symbols, with a degree of unconsciously unskillful language and ways that is a real affront to students of color and to their families. And I just want to add a little something to what Brittany said. Not so much what she said, but for your viewers and to the listeners, not to engage in trauma tourism. It is so easy to simply say, well, let's go pick the brains of kids of color to find out what their experiences are. Because we want to analyze, we want to analyze the situation. And so let's have these students of color relive or re-traumatize their experiences. That is not okay. Accept that it's happening and move forward from there.
Yeah, thank you for all of that, Curtis. It is also important to know. And I know a lot of teachers and administrators of color also who are exhausted on top of all that is exhausting right now. Perhaps their colleagues with well-intention say, oh, just tell me what I have to do. Tell me what I can do. I want to do better. Well, our job, each of us have the power and the ability to access information and find out what we need to do and not move forward on the backs of the labor of our colleagues of color. Another really important point when you talk about the birth of the nation is that we should all know there's this loud rumbling for patriotic education. And we need to understand, as you have talked about, Curtis, the benign neglect to do our due diligence. I love that. And that if we are holding on to these symbols, we don't know our history. And we really may not be acting with good intent. So Birth of the Nation was a KKK propaganda film, and it's so tied to American history. It was the first feature-length film made in Hollywood, and it was the first film that was screened at the White House. President Woodrow Wilson there had never been a president who showed a movie in the White House. So the very first one was that film. And so I think coming to a reckoning with this hard history is really important. And I always think about to have truth and reconciliation is everybody would love to have truth and reconciliation, but you got to have truth before you have reconciliation. So that's part of the truth.
Yeah, there's another sort of egregious aspect to this, particularly for Vermont and Confederate symbols.
Yes.
In the fact that we paid double what other states paid to finance, to underwrite the cost of the Civil War. We had the highest per capita deaths in the Union. So buried throughout Vermont are Civil War vets that the descendants of whom are currently going to high schools and elementary schools. And just the affront that those that are flying the Confederate flag or displaying, Nazi symbols, veterans from World War II, we need to do a better job teaching history.
Yeah. So that's a perfect transition to Corey Collins, who is joining us from Teaching Tolerance, which is doing incredible work as part of the Southern Poverty Law Center, dedicated to teaching hard history, dedicated to arming teachers and administrators, all educators all over the world, to build the capacity for anti-racism, inclusion, equity, and justice. And so the efforts of Randolph Union are not an aberration. They're not the only ones. They're doing some, there's some really great work that is happening. But we'd love to hear maybe a little bit more about what you see is working, and what can maybe help build capacity. We have a lot of educators from all over the world joining us who really care about this. So what are some approaches that you have seen work?
Sure. Thank you for that question, Homa, and thank you everybody that's contributing to this conversation. It's very important, and this story is very emblematic of something that's going across the country and across the world right now, in which we're having reckonings with racial injustice, and we're having reckonings with the ways in which that happens in our schools. And I think that one shortcoming perhaps is that a lot of school leaders who are maybe new to anti-racist work, or who are coming to this in this critical moment, they think that they are looking out over a field of unfertile soil, whereas in reality the tree is already there, and the tree is already casting a shadow over a lot of your students. This is a root and branch issue. Achieving racial justice in schools requires looking at the root and branch at all components of your school, whether that is looking at your curriculum and integrating standards of history and standards of learning that are more inclusive, whether that's looking at your special education program and how does that include students of all backgrounds, whether that's looking at your dress code policies and which cultures are more likely to be punished, if it's looking at your behavior policy and whether it's punitive for Black students or for undocumented students and puts them at risk of criminal justice system introduction or deportation. All of these things are part and parcel of becoming an anti-racist school. And there's no one seed that can be planted to make that tree, right? You have to tend to it. This is forever work. So one thing that I think is important is to realize that as much as a lot of us are seeking one size fits all answers, or as much as we are seeking like somebody to tell us what to do in this critical moment, it doesn't quite work like that, right? Like, so at the schools that are doing their best with this, one, they're exercising humility in knowing that they're not going to get it right tomorrow, and they're not going to get it right in a year. They're going to have to work at this forever, but they're also exercising a localization. So I profiled a school just outside of Boston last year, and one thing I really liked about what they were doing to introduce anti-racist work is they started with the community. They started with a survey to ask what students needed, what the community members needed, what had been missing from their education, what had been missing from their engagement with the school, what they wanted to see in a positive way, what were their dreams of the school, what could they imagine into it. And that feedback became instrumental in building then an educator-led, community-led professional development that is still ongoing. And I think that's important because it's a lot of school leaders we see will implement one PD, they'll do one webinar, and then they say, that's it, we've talked about anti-racism, and it just can't be like that. So at this school, they started with the community, and they also started with themselves. So a lot of this work begins with self-examination. In what ways am I perpetuating biases? What narratives am I telling in the classroom? What ways am I beholden to traditions or normalizing symbols? And the power of which shouldn't be understated, right? Like something like a mascot that students have on their jerseys, on their diplomas, the names, like that all matters and is part and wrapped up in identity. And once educators can have that self-reflection, then they can move forward with like, well, how do I correct that? You know, something like teaching hard history is a correction of a white supremacist narrative that has tried to whitewash our history for the comfort of white Americans. And I think that's sort of where I want to come around to, is that you all shared with me before this webinar some of the questions that were coming into you. And I saw more than one person asking, well, how do I address racial justice, racial injustice, but maintain unity and maintain peace in my school community? To which I would respond, unity and peace for whom? Because comfort isn't unity, comfort isn't peace for all of your students. If a lot of your students are under that shadow of racial injustice, they're not comfortable now, no matter how quiet the community seems. So it's worth standing up to that. So building capacity, as you said, I think is really important. And especially if you're a school leader or an educator, part of building capacity is like moving it up. Like, how do you convince district leaders? How do you convince superintendents? How do you convince other admin? And I would say, one, you say that this work isn't new. You have ancestors in this work. You look at the charter for the Mississippi Freedom Schools, and they're talking about better Black history curriculum. They're talking about giving students agency and promoting student activism. They're talking about a lot of the things that we see students demanding across the country now. Also, it works. We know that anti-racist education is good for students. Like, having a better history education is just a better education. Treating all students as valued members of a community leads to better outcomes, and thus, if your admin is concerned about graduation rates, mental health, physical health, all of those things are going to improve in an anti-racist environment. And lastly, public opinion's on your side. So part of this fear of backlash is because there's a very loud but small opposition to anti-racist education. When, you know, the SPLC just conducted a poll, and a vast majority of the American public supports anti-racist education across demographic groups, across political affiliations. All of that put together, it can arm you to start that conversation, get it approved, get it moving, but ultimately you have to keep it moving. And that's where that reflection and maintenance of an anti-racist environment comes in.
Yes, those are powerful points. Thank you. Jamila, I think, did you want to ask a question?
Sorry, just was releasing my mute. I'd like to go back to Elijah Hawks and learn a little bit more from him about the different initiatives that he took in the school. Some of them, he really encourages them to be student-led, like the Black Lives Matter flag. While it seemed like a good idea, he gave the charge to the students. I'd like you to work with the community, explain to them why does it matter, have the conversations. There's a lot of work that has been done with a new Racial Justice Alliance class, which is an elective that's available at Randolph Union High School. And then there was also the issue of independent students. With so few students, many of the students of color chose to be leaders in their school. One of them started a petition to bring down the mascot. 250 signatures were gathered. But in the process of doing that, this student had already been through so much, they actually walked away from it and never actually handed it over. And some of what really resonated for me in doing this story, in the chapter, we call it Not Okay. Everybody keeps saying this is not okay, this is not okay. It was not okay for that student to walk away. It really wasn't. It impacted several teachers at the school, who then decided to make it their initiative. So I'd like Elijah to talk to that. And while these are opportunities, I also hear in the silence, a lot has not been heard. And a lot of those moments of silence, the students who don't speak need to be heard.
So, Jamila, where do you want me to jump into that?
I mean, let's talk about how it's the role of educators, but students are also learning through the process. But have to be really careful with those students who went and spoke at community forums, were shouted at, yelled at, told that they were lying, their experiences were not true. And then you had to stand up and say, no, it's true. What's happening to these students happened. These threats are real. They're not making it up. I mean, but that is part of what we were talking about. Is that re-traumatizing for students? Is that, you know, these are part of the lessons I guess you're learning. And then whose role is it? If there is something that is so egregious to some, like that mascot, was it the teacher's role? Was it the student's role? Was it your role?
Right. And I think those are questions that we need to be wrestling with constantly, because there will be different right answers and perhaps multiple right answers and multiple wrong answers in any given circumstance. I feel like it's important for me as a school leader who has responsibility and authority to allocate resources to do it at all levels of the school, so that people have different access points into the work, into participation, into the kind of listening and learning that needs to be happening, so that the work is happening in classrooms, in faculty meetings, in special electives like the Racial Justice Alliance, where students can opt in or opt out. I think people need lots of opportunities to access the work, whether they're a young person of color, whether they're a 60-year-old white man who's starting to reflect for the first time on what white privilege actually might even mean. We need lots of different entry points into the work for different people, given their different identities. And then we need the work to be ongoing, as Corey was saying, and so that we can reflect on and learn from our mistakes. And sometimes I think white educators especially need to know that they're entering a sphere where they are going to not be experts, and they are going to be uncomfortable, and they are going to have to learn from mistakes. I'm not saying be a bull in a china shop and trample on people's experiences or re-traumatize anyone. But I think there needs to be that willingness to sit, listen, and learn after one has taken action. So again, part of my job is to allocate those resources to faculty meetings, to support teacher leaders, to support student leaders who want to step up and who want to step back, and to honestly reflect for myself where it is that I need to take a stand and take action with the truths that I've learned. Like when Curtis presented those two images to me, and I had a moment of awakening that I should have had long ago, but in a state of that innocence which constitutes the crime, to quote James Baldwin, that I was in when it came to that mascot. When I came out of that, I needed to realize the crime that was happening and take action to move us closer towards justice. So part of the work for me is being open and vulnerable and willing to listen and to learn from my mistakes as well.
And I also am curious if you could share with everyone, what is the status of the mascot? What has happened now? What unfolded? A lot of this is played out in our podcast for people who want the details, but where are you now? Because it's not really resolved.
Right, it's not really resolved. And the second episode of this chapter does a great job of painting that picture of the lack of resolution. So the mural that Curtis was referring to is no longer in the gym. It was painted over last spring at the instructions of the superintendent, who then told the community that we'd be reverting to an earlier rendition of the mascot, where it's still a rider on a horse, still looks more like a skeleton than a masked rider. But I haven't taken any steps to put any new image up anywhere. I'm not fully comfortable with the place where we're at right now. So we're in that state of uncertainty, and I expect the dialogue will continue this year, whether it's the Racial Justice Alliance or whether it's the teacher corps. Conversation and the work of this historical reckoning and this reckoning with who we are as a community is not over.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Reed, what kind of cautions do you have for people going forward with this work?
Well, To dovetail onto what Elisha just said, my first people need to understand, they need to suppress, all the educators and administrators need to suppress their socialization around instant gratification. We live in a society that I want it now, I want it yesterday, I want it in this quantity. That doesn't work in this field of endeavor. It takes time. It takes in Brattleboro 12, 13, 14, 15 years out, is still grappling with the issue. So one, you need to be in it for the long haul. One of the reasons why we have very few partners that are school districts is that administrators say, well, our school board will changes every 2 years. We don't know if we can get the sustained support for the kinds of changes that we know should happen. So that's sort of one bit of advice is you can work from the bottom up, but you're far more effective working from the top down in terms of structural reforms. I think Elijah's done a great job in terms of managing the situation within his one building, but there are multiple buildings in the school district. There are multiple school districts in the county. So, but ultimately we want a workforce that is anti-racist in its education. We want education that's anti-racist because out of pure economic survivability, our markets are changing, our demographics are changing, and if we have a workforce full of knuckleheads, Vermont, who is dependent upon tourism dollars, will find itself way behind the 8 ball if our workforce unintentionally or even intentionally wards off potential consumers of color, entrepreneurs of color, outdoor enthusiasts of color, venture capitalists of color. So we want to be able to have the long view and the long strategy so that a decade from now, 15 years from now, we have a workforce and a citizenry that is promulgating anti-racist policies and practices.
Absolutely. Thank you. There's a somewhat related question from the chat, Curtis, that talks about, she says, if you were to poll my state, Idaho, human rights, civil rights, Black Lives Matter are all very contentious subjects in our state house.
Mm-hmm.
Why
am I surprised?
Yeah. So anybody, Corey, Elijah, Curtis, Brittany, how would you address this? How do we build support to understand that Black Lives Matter is a fact as opposed to a controversial topic?
Well, we've always taken the position that, we don't argue this from a moral or social perspective, but we argue the point purely on economics, that both Idaho and Vermont are dependent upon tourism. People love to go fly fishing. We have a shrinking number of white heterosexual males with family incomes of $120,000 or more, which is where most state tourism bureaus are targeting. But there are Black and brown folks that fly fish, that ski, snowboard, that love the outdoors, camp, and that it's in your best economic interest to produce a workforce that subscribes to anti-racist principles. It gets you further ahead economically. You can expand your economic pie through having a workforce that is not either unintentionally or intentionally, shooing away shooing away consumers.
Brittany, what would you like to have change or see done?
Yeah, a big part of what just coming from the thoughts of a former student, I wish I had more knowledge just in general of history accurately. A lot of what I'm an advocate for is accurate, realistic depictions of full history of what's happened. I would say that a lot of places, even in my experience in school, is kind of that generic statement kind of whitewashed of what has happened for so many minorities, for so many people of color throughout history. And things like the Tulsa Massacre, the Black Wall Street, all of these instances of oppression that we don't even talk about, that we just say it was the civil rights era that happened in the 60s and then all things were good again. I feel like there needs to be a representation and we need to look at specifically how we teach our history and how we get people to notice, not only the people of color, that the mascot on the wall looks like a Ku Klux Klan member. Like, if we would have had accurate representations of our history and education, I feel like more people outside of the people of color would have noticed that sooner. And with that, I feel like that doesn't just extend only to students, it extends outside of that, because, many students go home and their parents are like, hey, what'd you do today? What did you learn? Like, how was school? And then if we're having these conversations at school and talking about these things and they bring that home, the parents in the same kind of realm might not understand. They might not have gotten the education in the history of that. And so they might not understand why this conversation is so important. And a lot of parents, or just people in general in the community outside of the schools, will kind of shut down those conversations and say that it's kind of ignoring and it's not a problem. And in my eyes, it's simply because a lot of people are ignorant on what is actually happening and naive about how lives have been for people of color, for minorities, for marginalized people. And it's important to begin at least with giving the education, giving the full details of what has actually happened, so that students and hopefully the community at large can take that and then form opinions based off of accurate depictions and form their ideas and their thoughts off of reality, rather than just nitpicked things to make it seem like a beautiful picture when it's not. We need to acknowledge that the picture of our history is terrifying, ugly, and it shouldn't have happened the way it did. And that's the first step for me, is we need to begin to want to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I would add to that, not only the tragedy that has happened to folks of color over time, but also our contributions to American society. Talking about Matthew Henson that went to the North Pole, talking about York that went with Lewis and Clark out west. The contributions of Vermonters like Alexander Twilight or Reverend Henderson. There are a lot of contributions that we make that go unacknowledged. And students of color and white students equally need to see that throughout our history, not only have we been the victims or survivors of racial injustice, but we've also made significant contributions to our society.
Absolutely. Before we wrap up, this hour is going so quickly. I'd like to ask Elijah to respond, and then also Corey, if you'd like to add a quick, both of you, a brief comment, please.
I'm inspired by what Brittany and Curtis are saying about the curriculum, and I think it's important to note the conversation that's happening right now across the United States and perhaps across the globe about what to teach in our classrooms, and how the 1619 Project is being disparaged, or the Howard Zinn People's History of the United States is being, thrown around as something to be excluded from the curriculum. There's a perfect opportunity right now this week for any school to say, okay, it's that people are debating this. Let's listen to the 1619 podcast ourselves and make up our own minds about whether or not this is something important to include in the curriculum. Let's read Howard Zinn's People History together. Mm-hmm. Let's carve out, and this is to the administrators on the podcast, let's carve out at least an hour a month of our precious faculty meeting time to devote to having these kinds of conversations. Let's jump right in at the level of faculty and start discussing the curriculum and the contemporary controversy that's playing out. And that's going to happen as our president weighs into these matters of what is patriotic and what it means to be an American, or what it means to live in quote unquote Western civilization. Let's jump right in. I've got an hour a week set aside, an hour a month set aside for this work in our faculty meeting professional development calendar. And I think I'm just thinking right now that the 1619 podcast would be something that I want everyone to be informed about what this debate is actually about by listening to it, which I would imagine a lot of people weighing in on the debate on the national stage haven't actually done.
Yeah, absolutely. Corey?
Yeah, something I'm thinking about is we just had an article that came out from Jamila Pitts, and she talks about how anti-racism is love. So I want to lift up a lot of what Curtis was just saying, that it is instrumental to this work to reckon with the most difficult aspects of our history and how that shaped where we are today. But that has to be counterbalanced with emphasis on joy, resilience, contributions. When we say representation matters, part of that equation is being able to see how you have thrived, how you have lived in this world, how you have moved through this world, and how the ancestors who came before you got you here. For any of us who may feel underrepresented, whether it's me as a gay man or somebody as a person of color, when you first meet that first ancestor who made it through, who thrived, who was celebrated, it's instrumental to your well-being. So I just, pre-colonial history is American history. African history is American history. Latinx history is American history. So I would just really appreciate Curtis's point that we have to emphasize those things in conjunction, because not just because it's a balance, but because it's the truth.
Mm-hmm. And I want to give one shout out to Lerone Bennett. If you've never read Before the Mayflower, it's an excellent book. I would juxtaposition it next to Howard Zinn book, but it's written by a Black historian. I think it's still in print. I remember reading it when I was 50 years ago. But it's an excellent introduction, particularly for students of color, of the history of persons of African descent before they arrived here in the United States. So,
thank you. Fantastic. There's one more chat. There have been some great comments and questions in the chat. One of them, just before we wrap up, asks, and I think a lot of people are wondering this, any community prep required, or literally jump into community conversation and debate? What suggestions, if any, do you have prior to inviting the community to engage? Maybe in one sentence, one tip that each of you might offer on that. How do you get a community to engage? And is it wise to bring everyone into the room at the same time immediately?
Know your history, one.
Okay. Anybody else?
My quickest answer is to set expectations ahead of time and make it an upfront dialogue that allows the community to also decide how this conversation is going to occur, not to enforce it upon them.
And I would say work inward, outward. I need to do the work myself, and then I need to do the work with my colleagues, and then we need to do the work with our students, and then we need to do There's something of that needs to be happening. And also I think every school needs to establish with its community that they are valued. There are aspects of who they are. Every family history has value to it, and we value you in the conversation. There are also some rules to this conversation, which we also need to go over so that everyone is protected and no one is derided.
Yeah. Brittany, do you have anything that you would advise?
I would just say that this kind of conversation is ultimately, in my eyes, coming into this for growth of students and the growth of knowledge and thought. And so it's not just having to remind and remember, it's not about being combative or dismissive or divisive. It is simply to provide a community and a space for growth and learning and to foster that. That is where it's coming from, and we have to stay kind of grounded in that.
Fantastic. Jamila, do you want to add any final word here?
Oh, she's still muted.
Okay, while you're thinking about that, while you unmute, I want to share, because we are at the top of the hour. I don't know if this comes through as a full screen. We wanted to just share a few upcoming events for the Big Questions Institute. We have this weekend, schools that want to engage in futures thinking and scenario planning. We have some short, join us in pajamas on a Saturday for an hour and a half to tackle some big questions around how do we act with strategic foresight in our schools. We have a free webinar on October 5th with Gary Steger and Sylvia Martinez on teaching like the future depends on it. They are fantastic presenters. We are going to go deeper into this topic October 26th and 27th with a Deeper Than Diversity workshop. And then in October on the 14th, we start our series of New Leadership Lenses, which has been a really exciting sort of forward-thinking learning experience. And we hope that it is really clear that in all the work that we are striving to do at the Big Questions Institute, we want to center equity and center justice. And unless we do that, then there is no innovation. So you can't have innovation without psychological safety, without welcoming sort of Curtis's argument about the sheer economics of it. So schools that work the best are the ones that don't lose out on powerful voices like Brittany's. I think you make that really clear, Brittany. So we just are so grateful for each of you. You have brought so much, and I'm kind of wondering if we could do this again in the near future, in a few months, maybe after November, because this magnitude of how important this conversation is only going to grow. I also want to add that in the chat, Will has posted a link, and maybe you can post it again, to the podcast Sounds Like Hate. It is outstanding, and many more episodes are going to be rolled out. So thank you so much to each of you. Yes, Jamila, go ahead.
I also want to thank you for all you've done. And my one tip is go have a conversation with someone you normally wouldn't have a conversation with.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I think relationships, that's the secret sauce. We are humans seeking that connection. So thank you, all of you. Thank you to so many people. We really had an amazing global audience with us today, and your contributions, I know, have really rung true for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we're off.